What are your thoughts on 50-50 relationships?
What does that mean?
You pay half, I pay half.
I'm old school. I'm gonna pay for everything.
Are you expecting old school values in a new school woman? Because that's not how they're wired.
First of all, let's keep it real. These are two rich men talking about whether or not they are paying bills for a woman or not. It is a status symbol, a masculine status symbol for men to be in a position to be able to pay all the bills for their woman. So, of course, if you have the money to do it, most men are going to choose to pay all the bills because he can brag. He can have bragging rights to say, I pay all the bills of my home. My wife don't have to worry about nothing. It's similar to getting married when you get older. Most men would love to be single and live the bachelor life for the rest of their life. But it's when you get older, it actually is a status symbol for you to have found a woman and created a home and created a family. That's why when we look at our presidents, it's very rare that you're going to see a president who is single, because on a status level, people respect married men. So in order for you to show that you have status, a family, a wife, and it shows security, financial security specifically, because a woman chose you to marry. So we're not going to ignore that being able to take care of your family solely by yourself brings status. So most of the time people are going to choose to do that. But I also want to create some nuance around this idea of that being old school. You choose it because you can do it. There's a long history of men, and most of the men now, who have a problem with these kind of status questions because it brings their status into question. There's a lot of men who can't afford to do that, even if they wanted to. So I know when I say this, that this is going to sound like a duh moment, but I feel like we sometimes forget that this is our truth, okay? So we did not live through the economic traditions of white America. We did not live through that in the same way. There was a difference, AKA because of racism. But we didn't go through some of their traditions or have access to some of their ideals. Do you see what I'm saying? So let me tell you why I'm saying that, because that seems like a duh moment. But one of the myths that I hate is the myth that old school relationships where men are taking care of their woman, they paying for everything, and she's sitting up in the house and just taking care of children and cleaning the house and cooking and cleaning, and he's paying all the bills like a king and blah, 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 blah. This kind of, whatever that ideal, relationship, that is a myth that only a select few were able to live up to. Even in the white community, that was an ideal that some people didn't have access to, but definitely for us as Black folks. Black women had to work. Black women had to contribute to the households. That's why they were maids and nurses and seamstresses and laundresses and sharecroppers and secretaries and factory workers. They did all of those jobs. When we got out of slavery, they had to go into the workforce to contribute. They had to do it alongside Black men. They had to do it together. It was never a situation where the majority of our people had access to the lifestyle of a man going to work and having and making enough money to pay all the bills. That was not our truth. Racism didn't allow Black men the upward mobility and the financial security to do that. Here's some statistics from the U.S. Department of Labor from like the 30s up from the Great Depression on until now. If you look at the breakdown by race, what white men were making in the 30s, if you add Black women and men, we weren't even making what they were making together on average. We were making just a little bit over what white women were making alone. I want us to read this last line because I think it adds nuances to the Black family in our experience. In family rather than individual incomes are compared, the Negro white difference is somewhat less, as a higher proportion of the Negro family members are in the labor force. So I want you to think about that. Because in our families at this time, we all had to fucking work. Our men, our women, and our of age children. So sometimes we would have more money than an individual white person would. And so that economic power can bring some disdain, that jealousy, envy, and resentment. Imagine if you are a young, ambitious white woman wanting to do more with your life than be some wife, and you see the Negroes out here doing that or trying to do that, even under this system that is disenfranchising them. We don't get this articulation until, in the early 60s with Betty Friedan and her book Feminine Mystique, until second wave feminism. But this socioeconomic paradigm for them started as soon as Black people become free and they got to take care of their own homes and breastfeed their own children and do all the things that they are now selling to white women they're supposed to do as a wife, which they didn't have to do before. You start having these marriage manuals pop up about how a wife is supposed to be in the home that was very different than how she was supposed to be during slavery. And even here is a letter from Annie Brown Adams, which is the daughter of the famous abolitionist John Brown, who wrote a friend lamenting about the struggle for a married woman's rights will be a longer and a harder fight battle than any other that the world has ever known. She declared that men have been taught that they are absolute monarchs in their families. These tactics that she's talking about, this mindset that she is giving in this letter, is classic white liberal woman. Like, she's on the right side of history when it comes to wanting to reform and dismantle slavery, but she is centering her own needs by saying it's these marriage dynamics that are kicking my ass. And this is a side note, but it's just important for me to put it here. This socioeconomic situation actually solidifies the tension between white women and the Black community, especially during this time where there's a cultural shift changing when it comes to race. This is where we get the women's suffrage, like Susan B. Anthony saying shit like this: I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballots for the Negro and not the woman. She also said, what words can express her humiliation when at the close of this long conflict, the government, which she has served so faithfully, held her unworthy of a voice in its councils, while it recognizes as the political superiors of all the noble women of the nation, the Negro men just emerged from slavery, and not only totally illiterate, but also densely ignorant of every public question. And last but not least, the old anti-slavery school says women must stand back and wait until the Negro shall be recognized. But we say, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of the woman be brought up first, and that of the Negro last. Baby Miss Thing was mad about us getting some power, some rights, a voice, because she felt like, I'm a white woman. White. But anyway, so these statistics around finance and around money also equates to power dynamics changing. You feel what I'm saying? And it sparks this long tension that white women have to battle when it comes to their status as a woman and their status as being white. where they have to choose between fighting for their oppression as a woman and standing aligned with their whiteness just to be able to get that privilege. This is where that tension begins in our country. This is also where the beginning of the idea that Black men have that feminism started with white women. Because at this time, the two people that were really neck and neck in fighting for power were white women and Black men. Neck and neck is kind of stretching it, but very, very close, because Black men was appealing to white men's manhood, that I want to be seen as a man. And white women was appealing to white men's whiteness, because I'm a white woman. How dare you, after we have stood by your side and they have been indoctrinated in the belief that whiteness equals holy, it equals morality, it equals clean, it equals intelligence. How dare you try to shift the power dynamic and allow these men, ape men, niggas, however, with a hard R, however you want to call them, come above us when we bear your children. We have been indoctrinated in this idea that we are, because of our whiteness, we are better than them. And so these two people have the propensity to ignore the Black woman, even though when it came to race, we were putting fire under the tails of Black men. When it came to gender oppression, we were calling them to the mat when we were fighting for racial justice and equity, saying, hey, don't forget us. And also, when it comes to women's suffrage, we were putting fire under the tails of white women. Like, no, don't forget that we are in a different situation when it comes to race, even though we are women. White women was pedestalized in this way. That's why we get these people, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Susan B. Anthony, all them people, all these early first movement feminist names that we know, because they were battling for women's rights. Black women simultaneously was battling for women's and Black rights. Do you see what I'm saying? So we were creating the more intersectional nuance of both of these movements happening together, Black movement and the women's movement. And that's when we get people like Harriet Jacobs and Mary Prince and Phyllis Whitley sharing their stories and adding some nuance to the experience. Because if you look at the earlier slave narratives, one of the first ones that we talk about, because he's a man, is Frederick Douglass. But we have a whole other one that didn't get as much shine, Harriet Jacobs. And there's a nuance, there's a difference that she brings to the conversation, because while we all are experiencing this kind of racial oppression and the brutality that comes with slavery, I have to deal with my children being taken away. I have to deal with the lust of this white man and my children being literally sold, not only for the economic benefit of it, but also to save the dignity of his white wife from having to see my children, because it's evidence of the lust that he has for me. So my children are not just being sold just because, I can make more money to sell by selling these, Black babies that I've made, biracial babies that I made. I'm selling them so that my wife doesn't have to deal with the embarrassment of these biracial children running around our plantation. So it lets everybody socially know that he's sneaking in the slave quarters with the dirty, nasty, beastly slaves. Because remember, she has been indoctrinated into the idea that being a white woman is the pure and holy. And I've married this man, and my job is to be chaste and to give him his legacy and his children. Here he goes sneaking in the slave quarters, having babies, having children that are growing up trying to be abolitionists, that are growing up trying to get the right to vote. trying to get power. No, ship them little nigglets off to save my dignity. How dare you? No, you're not keeping them on the plantation. You're gonna sell them off, and we're gonna get some money for them. Harriet's narrative gave a Black feminist nuance of there's a difference between us, between the men in slavery and between the women. Another example is, so we're talking about the Me Too movement now. We talked about it in the 90s when Anita Hill was the spark of sexual violence in the workplace. But there were also a moment in time when white women and Black women were fighting for women's rights against being sexually assaulted by men, like randomly. Because if they're on the street and you don't have the class to protect you from being touched and being harmed, and poor white women and newly freed slave girls were being raped randomly, there was this force of this movement to bring the courts involved to say, hey, as a woman, I don't have any protections over these men doing this to me. Black women are getting the rights of being a human, of being a woman. Finally, they weren't considered a woman before. Get into that trans humanity parallel right there, that arbitrary line of what woman is. Anyway, now I'm getting the right to be a woman, so that means I get the right to bring criminal charges about rape now. So this is a book called Sex, Love, and Race, Crossing Boundaries in North American History by Martha Holds. It's a bunch of essays. Blah, 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 blah. I want to read this to y'all. Southern white sex reformers who had a distinctive stake in maintaining racial hierarchy held white men accountable for both intraracial tension and interracial conflict. At the most immediate level, the sexual actions of many individual white men pose daily practical problems for white and Black women, as well as Black men. But for all those actors, elite white men's sexual power also indicated their systematic power over Southern legal, political, economic institutions. Challenging white men's sexual prerogatives then entail confronting white men's political hegemony. Activists and scholars such as Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells have argued that white Southerners fashioned images of Black male sexuality in response to African American political agenda. So too were images of white men's sexuality tied to the political power of white men. Reformers struggled to control the sexual conduct of white men was a part of the broader challenges to white men's political economic control. So the efforts of African American activists and legislators set the precedent for white women's sex reform initiatives. In the 1890s, Black women criticized white men's sexual behavior. Unlike white women, they focused consistently on white men's aggression against all women. At the height of the age of consent debates, Ida B. Wells directed the public spotlight on white men's sexual crimes, publicizing the name of those who had raped Black women and girls. White men, she argued, were not so desirous of punishing rapists as they pretended to be. I think this is a perfect time to go back to Annie Brown's letter, because when she was sending her letter to her friend about the woes of married life for a woman, one of the things that she mentioned in the letter was decency in how some of the things that were happening to her or happening to women in general as wives were so gross and indecent and immoral. Listen to what she says. Women are taught that their only hope of heaven is to endure to the end. That is a religious duty to submit themselves to their husbands in all things. She goes on to say, I know a man who tells his wife, I own you. I have a deed, aka a marriage license and certificate to you. I got it recorded. I have a right to do what I please to you. And the law of the Christian land says that she shall submit to indecencies that would make a respectable devil blush for shame. So Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a Black woman, and she warned white women to reform themselves. She urges white reformers at the 1896 Sex Reform Convention to include domestic servants in their social purity projects. No mistress of the home should be morally indifferent to the safety of any person under their roof. This is a battle that both Black women and white women were suffering from, but Black women were saying, you got our harm on your hands too. When it happens to you, you're like up in arms, but when it's happened to us, you are ignoring it. And while white men had the institutional and economic power to protect themselves from being held accountable for the harms against women, don't let me forget Black men too, who also harmed us within our own community when it comes to abuse and sexual assault and all those kind of things.
I gotta go to school.
That's how we get a person like Eldridge Cleaver admitting that he started raping Black women to practice on how to rape white women. I flew into a rage at myself, at America, at white women, at the history that had placed these tensions of lust and desire in my chest. Cleaver resolved to join the ruthlessness of his heroes with the racialized sexual aggression of his own devices. Once he was free, he wrote, I became a rapist. To refine my technique and MO, I started out by practicing on Black girls in the ghetto. And when I considered myself smooth enough, I crossed the tracks and sought out white prey. 12 months later, he returned to prison, sentenced to 14 years for serial rape, assault, and attempted murder. This is dark, but I appreciate his honesty because what we are getting is a rare glimpse into the dark areas of somebody's mind and how racism can warp how we think about sexuality, how it can warp our preferences. We love to act like our preferences are not rooted in these ugly systems. It is no coincidence that the man who is battling these desires that are informed by the racism and lust for white women would be married to the one member of the Black Panther Party with light skin and blue eyes that look like Rachel Dolezal, Kathleen Cleaver. It is no coincidence that this type of man with these type of desires would end up with this fully Black woman that almost looks white. And how it can lead to the harm of the most marginalized of us. We see it in the dynamics of the harm that affect Black women of all kinds, cis or trans. Why we are being murdered by our intimate partners. How we are not able to get the luxury of humanity or empathy when it comes to somebody deciding whether or not to harm us. So he wasn't getting arrested and charged for these crimes until he started to victimize white women. That is when the justice system stood up to snag him and put him behind bars. But this wasn't to protect us as Black women. Us, we don't have the protection. At least the cultural idea is that these systems, these institutions like police and, the judicial system is to protect the chastity of a white woman.
There is an African-American man. I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately.
So at least if she is harmed, she has that system to help her. Yes, it's racist, but she at least has that system. What system do we have, did we have back then to protect us from that harm? From white men or Black men? None. So there are no systematic protections and there's no cultural protections coming from any of the three entities that we're demographics that we're talking about. When we talk about white women, we talk about Black men, when we talk about white men, when we talk about these entities that are fighting and battling for power, we are at the bottom. And so there's nothing in the system to protect us. So we have to latch on and move these two people, these two demographics. I'm sharing this because these are moments where Black women have on both sides attempted to put some nuance in the experiences of womanhood in these various types of oppression when it comes to race, when it comes to gender, and how those things intersect. This is the intersectionality 101, Black feminist 101. This is not new, but I'm just trying to give you context of how these movements that we associate with white women, Black women have always been there to insert that racial nuance with them. So the idea that feminism started with them, as if Black women weren't going through gender oppression, is a patriarchal concept, because a racist patriarchal concept, because you are ignoring the intersection of being a Black person and a female-bodied woman in a world that is oppressive against both of those things. And if you are intentionally ignoring that experience just to invalidate feminism, that makes you a bad person, sir. But anyway, back to that ideal situation of the men paying for everything. That's a myth. Yes, that was a cultural ideal that people were striving for because we were mimicking the cultural ideas of white America because of respectability politics, all that kind of stuff. But that was a rare economic situation for us, especially. We weren't in those situations. Did more people become the ideal as time went on when we had cultural advancements? Absolutely. But that still, even to this day, but definitely back then, was not our truth. We had to be together to make it economically work. Only people who had access to that ideal was particularly people who were of the lighter complexion. We know how colorism works. We know how Jim Crow works. We know who was considered clean and who was considered an amazing testament to their race, to the people who had power at the time. We know how that works when it comes to access to education. There was a certain people who can move into these white neighborhoods that had enough money to create the white flight situation that we would learn and, force redlining and gerrymandering and all that kind of stuff. There was a certain type of people who had that access. That was not all of us. We had to work. We had to work and contribute to help out our men. That was the norm. So this idea that these two rich men are talking about, tradition, as in we all had that tradition, that was not our tradition. Tradition is we all shared in the contributions to the household. And because of patriarchy, it was the image to the world that the man was the lead. To spare his ego and make him seem more like the white man, we had to make him look like this patriarch that was taking care of everything in order to be respectable in the eyes of the church, in the eyes of the society. We had to mimic that ideal, try to get as close to that ideal as possible. Black women had to minimize themselves in their actual contribution to make their partner look like the ideal patriarch, even though the balance of power and contribution was quite equal. But because we needed to give heirs in our community and their community to even have access to, any type of luxury, any type of stability and survival, we had to do that. And now that we're moving forward culturally and things are shifting, we're in a time of truth-telling about the disparities between women and men, the differences in that regard. These issues are coming up. I wish we would examine that myth and stop talking about it like that was our experience. And that is the problem with centering white people in our conversation. Sometimes we are centering white people's experience and it's not really ours. And it's not being directly said, but this is one of those situations where it wasn't our tradition. It wasn't a tradition for us. And we don't have to say that, but you can tell because clearly we're forgetting that wasn't our socioeconomic truth. Anyway, I hate that myth.
See, you care too much what they think. Focus on me, cause I'm the only one who's always there whenever you need. Yeah.